And then, because it's a longitudinal study, we asked people about their working conditions and classified them each time we asked them. So this is 1 exposure, 2 exposures, at intervals over time, 3 or more exposures, and the odds of developing the metabolic syndrome of insulin resistance, central adiposity, high blood pressure, low HDL cholesterol, high triglyceride, which puts you at increased risk of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. The more stress at work, the greater the metabolic syndrome. So quality of work matters. Social protection. This, of course, is a very current issue in Europe because of the global financial crisis. Countries all over Europe are cutting social spending. This was a study David Stuckler and colleagues published last year in the British Medical Journal, looking at all-cause mortality in 18 European countries and social spending per capita, social spending, government social spending, adjusting for purchasing power. And you see this clear inverse relation. The lower the degree of government social spending, the higher the mortality. And they looked over time, and changes in government social spending were related to changes in mortality. Health equity in all policies really matters, really matters. And I get so frustrated with these debates among economists. I was sitting at dinner with the president of Glasgow University, who's a distinguished economist, and I said, would it be fair to characterize the debate that the free marketeers believe that you've got to cut the deficit in order to get economic growth, and the Keynesians believe you've got to get economic growth in order to cut the deficit? I said, is that a fair characterization of the debate? And he said, yeah, that about sums it up. I said, who's right? Well, then he gave me a slightly wishy-washy answer. And I said, what do you economists do in the universities? If you can't sort this out, what on earth do you do? Because this makes a real difference. And then I said, if you can't sort it out, I've got a criterion for you. Evaluate your policies by the effect on the lives people are able to lead. And the way I'll measure that is health equity. You cut social spending, mortality goes up. So it's not, well, one group of economists think this and one group of economists think that, and the one we'll take is this one. It should be, what's going to have the biggest impact on health equity? So I would say this is real. And everybody in this room could be advocates for introducing this into the policy debate. I hope the First Lady's advisor is taking note. This comes from our Nordic Knowledge Network. I told you I love the Norwegians. For the Commission, we asked the Swedish government, I asked the Swedish government, would they fund a network? Because I said, everybody wants to know what the Nordic countries did right. What I don't want to know is that 200 years ago, preachers taught people to read so they could read the Bible, and only 200 years later, you had good health. Most of us have got a rather more compressed timetable than that. We'd like to know what we can learn from the Nordic experience of the welfare state that would potentially be applicable in other countries of the world now. Because most people think Sweden is on another planet or in a different solar system. from everybody else. We want to know what we can learn that we could do now. And they produced this for us. Look at the UK and the US. These are poverty levels, and the first figure is before taxes and transfers. So that's, and poverty is defined as less than 60% median income. And you can see before taxes and transfers, poverty levels are higher in the UK than they are in the United States. After taxes and transfers, we get a 50% drop in poverty levels in the UK, but only a 24% drop in the United States. And when I talk in the US, I say to colleagues, what do you want the poverty level to be? That's a social decision. You want a high poverty level or do you want a low poverty level? Because the government can do it. In fact, the Minister of Finance may well have more impact on health and the distribution of health than the Minister of Health. Because the Minister of Finance is making ethical or unethical policy decisions that are affecting the poverty level. So you clearly, I say to them, have decided that you want a high poverty level. They look a bit uncomfortable at that point. But if you're going to have a debate about policy, at least know what the evidence shows, then you can have a proper debate. And in Finland, Norway and Sweden, the effects of taxes and transfers are to reduce poverty levels by more than 70%. They've decided they don't like poverty, so they'll have government action to reduce it. And this is family policy generosity and child poverty as an example of how it works. So child poverty levels, you can see, are very low in Finland, Sweden and Norway, and they have very generous family policies. They support two parents working, there's generous child care available, state-funded child care available, there's support for two parents to be in work, and there's generous maternity and paternity leave when babies are born. And we in the UK are pretty mean when it comes to family policy, and in the US they're meaner still, which is why they have high poverty levels. And minimum income for healthy living. Let me just say another word about that. We did calculations in England as to what is the minimum necessary for a healthy life. The minimum. It's been put to me by colleagues working in sub-Saharan Africa that this is totally out of reach in sub-Saharan Africa. How on earth could you start to do a calculation about the minimum income necessary for a healthy life? They said it's just inconceivable in sub-Saharan Africa. I countered by saying, right at the heart of our calculations about minimum income for healthy living is the possibility of leading a life with dignity and participating fully in society. Would you not want to put the possibility of leading a life of dignity and participating fully in society at the heart of everything you do? They said, if that's what you mean by minimum income for healthy living, yeah, we can see how we would apply that in sub-Saharan Africa. And I would hope that's an approach that you would take in Latin America and in Peru. The possibility of leading a life of dignity that allows you to participate fully in society. I visited the Northern Territory of Australia recently, Australia ranks, I think, 3rd in the Human Development Index. If you ranked Indigenous Australians, if you treated them as a separate country, they would rank 102nd. In the Northern Territory of Australia, you can't believe you're in the same country as Sydney or Melbourne. You think, where am I? I can't believe this. Now, the challenge for Indigenous Australians and for people who are trying to make policy is, what's the model? What's the life that people would seek to lead, have reason to value, to put it in Amartya Sen's terms? Do they want to be engineers and lawyers? Or do they want to be hunter-gatherers? Or some uneasy combination of the two? I can't decide that. You can't decide that. That's got to be some sort of collective decision, a model of what leading a life of dignity means. And then government policy should try and serve that model, but not say you're going to be a second-rate engineer or you're going to be a dropout, or what we're seeing with Australian Aboriginals. Life expectancy for Australian Aboriginals is 17 years shorter than the average for non-Indigenous Australians. So it's not working, but looking at the approach of leading a life of dignity that you have reason to value seems to me the way forward. And universal health care is, of course, important. We are about to undergo a massive reorganisation of the National Health Service in Britain. These are figures from the Commonwealth Fund for rich countries, looking at cost-related access problems in the past year. So in Austria, people of below average income are more likely to have difficulty in accessing health care because of cost than people of above average income. Canada, France, Germany, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden, the UK. Now I say to colleagues, we may be really crap at football, but we've done something really well. We ought to be proud of this major societal achievement. We've achieved equity in access to health care. We still have inequalities in health because it's not due to inequities in access to health care. It's due to the wider social determinants of health. But I say nothing that the government is proposing in terms of reorganizing the healthcare system should in any way detract from this major societal achievement of equity and access to healthcare. So a principle of universal access has to be applauded and has to be the right way forward. By itself, it won't solve the problem of health inequities because we have to address the wider determinants. And the importance of local action. Let me tell you about the firefighters in Liverpool, in the English city of Liverpool. Wonderful story, apart from the fact that I achieved my lifelong ambition from boyhood and had my photo taken with a fire chief in front of a fire engine. But I was taken to the fire station. I thought, what am I doing in the fire station? So they told me this story. They said, as firefighters, we spend 6% of our time fighting fires. The other 94% of the time is, well, your guess is as good as mine, playing poker, moonlighting, whatever. They're preparing, keeping fit, preparing, polishing the fire engines, polishing their boots, and so on. And they said, we would come back from fighting a fire where somebody had died, and we'd say, that was so unnecessary. They should have done something about preventing that fire. And then we thought maybe we should do something about preventing that fire. Everybody loves firefighters, so they're respected by the local community. So they started going into local homes and fitting smoke alarms. And then they said, do you know who dies in fires? It's the poor, it's smokers, it's heavy drinkers, it's people with mental illness. They started running down a checklist of risk factors for health inequities. And they said, we started trying to educate people not to smoke in bed. And then we said, why don't we try and get them not to smoke at all? So then they became active. The firefighters became active in health promotion, in anti-smoking. And then while they were fitting smoke alarms, they realized that, the house wasn't quite right. And they said to people, you could get a government grant to fix up your house. Really? That sounds really complicated. How would I do that? We'll help you. The firefighters became social workers, and they started helping them negotiate government grants. And then the kids, these are deprived areas, were in gangs, getting into trouble, and so on. So the firefighters got together with Liverpool Football Club and started running physical fitness classes for the children. Then they thought, what about the old people? So they had a gym in the fire station, and they gave senior citizens a pass so they could use the gym that the firefighters used to keep fit. So the older people. And then they told me, when you go to the English city of Liverpool, which has got amongst the worst life expectancy in England, they boast. They say, this is the most deprived local area in England. I went to 16 of those local areas, each of which was described as the most deprived in England. So this boasting, my area is more deprived than yours. So they go to these children from this deprived area, and they say, would you like to come and play on a fire engine? Oh, would I what? Then they get them in to play on the fire engine, and the children say, what are those things growing out of the ground? And they say, they're vegetables. Vegetables? What do you do with vegetables? You eat them. Really? I thought you only ate things that came in a packet with salt and sugar added. No, they're vegetables, and you can grow them and then eat them. Hey, that's amazing. So they get these deprived kids growing vegetables. So this is what the firefighters are doing. The year I spent as president of the British Medical Association, the BMA, I went to the general practitioners and said, if the firefighters can do this, surely the doctors could do this. Why don't you try and catch up with what the firefighters are doing? So this is local action. This is taking action right there on the ground. The other end of the scale, this untidy looking gentleman is the Mayor of London. Now, most of us have enough narcissism that when the photographer comes, we sort of, if we have any hair left, we do this, But Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London, does this before the photographer comes, so that's part of his persona. I went to see him, and which was quite an experience, which I'll tell you about some other time. I went to see him, and I asked him, tried to encourage him, to take on board my review of health inequalities in England, the English review. He said, what would that involve? So I spelt it out. He said, okay, let me think about it. And he did. And they are. And there's a London health inequalities strategy. We are working with the office of the Mayor of London, a conservative, a leading conservative politician. I stress that because I'm trying to make the case that we appeal to left-wing governments and right-wing governments and centre governments, because we're trying to say this issue is too important for politics. I said that to one politician who said, this issue is so important that it requires politics. But it's another issue, but the Mayor of London has taken it on. And I said to the Mayor in Lima this morning, if Lima was really going to get active, given that we're working with London, maybe we could actually have some exchange. We could learn from what happens in Lima. Lima could learn from what happens in London. But London, Lima, Leningrad, I don't know, Lesotho, I think we could get a partnership. In Sweden, I've appealed on a few occasions to the national government, and they're doing a bit. But the city of Malmö set up its own commission, the Commission for a Socially Sustainable Malmö, or Commission on Social Determinants of Health for the city of Malmö. And also in Sweden, the city of Gothenburg has done it. And the aim is to translate the findings of the Commission on Social Determinants of Health into a form suitable to address social determinants and health inequalities in Malmö. So we've got examples of people getting really practical and really detailed to say, how can we do this? And the goal is really worth striving for. The goal is to create a fairer society, one in which we have the conditions in which individuals and communities have control over their lives and participate fully in society. Thank you. Well, I've already said two slightly contradictory things. One is that I'm an optimist, and the other is that I always appeal to the evidence. And so they could be contradictory, but I don't think they are. Firstly, when you think what happened in the social determinants arena post Almirata in 1978, what we had was structural readjustment. What we had was the Washington Consensus. What we had was economic rationality. Did you hear the word equity mentioned post-Almirata? Fairness? What we heard was people have to pay. If they don't pay, they don't value. We're still hearing that. I'm hearing garbage that unless people pay for bed nets, they won't use them. The economists went and looked at that question, and they found it's quite wrong. It's quite wrong. The likelihood of using a bed net for the purpose for which it was intended is independent, uncorrelated with the amount of money people paid. They don't have to pay in order to use it. But we had this sort of economic dogma instead of evidence-based policy. So we really didn't do much to try and implement either comprehensive primary health care post-Almirata or the social determinants part of Almirata. I think we've learned something from those mistakes. And the mere fact that I can point to Norway, to Denmark, to parts of Sweden, to Slovenia, to Brazil, to Chile, to a number of countries, to India, to the UK, that have taken on the social determinants approach, the fact that we're going to have this summit in Rio next month suggests to me that we've got more likelihood of it being taken up now than we had in 1978. The question is how the rich countries are going to address the issue of the global financial crisis. As somebody smarter than me said, you should never waste a good crisis. There's some real likelihood we're going to waste this one. And instead of taking this as an opportunity to do things differently, there's some chance that we'll go crawling after trying to re-establish the same way of doing things. I mean, was it a week ago that UBS Bank, they had a rogue trader who lost 2 billion something, Swiss francs, euros, forgotten which unit it was, but it was 2 billion of them that he lost. Now we had a global financial crisis that began in the financial sector that brought the world's economy to its knees, and what have we learned from that? Nothing at all. We let the banks do things in exactly the same way. So I'm optimistic because a lot of countries are taking it up, but that doesn't mean that I'm ignoring the evidence of the problems and the challenges. But we've got to face those problems and challenges to take this seriously.
Thanks, Dr. Rey or Dr. Franco.
Bien, profesor Marmot. Luego de lo señalado por el ministro de Salud, quizá ya no corresponde que el Ministerio exprese una posición, simplemente reiterarle que estamos en el compromiso, tal como lo conversamos el día de ayer. El día de mañana, además, hay una reunión con ministros de Estado, justamente para recuperar sus palabras en el sentido de que cada ministro debe ser un ministro de Salud.
Buenas tardes, nuevamente, señor Marmot. Solamente a nosotros nos parece que estamos en el Perú en una oportunidad muy importante. Estamos en un gobierno que reclama que la inclusión social es su bandera, y eso es un punto bastante importante, lo cual implica que cómo logramos nosotros que en este concepto de inclusión social tenga cabida todo este enfoque de los determinantes de la salud, y que tengamos un Estado como conjunto que responda a esos temas. Y una acotación que nos parece importante que nos pueda aclarar: ¿cuál ha sido el rol de la sociedad civil, de los ciudadanos, en estos procesos que usted ha investigado, o los procesos que se han liderado en varios de estos países? ¿Qué nivel de participación tiene la ciudadanía? Y desde nuestro punto de vista creemos que debe ser protagónica, en una esfera de mayor cohesión social, mayor democracia. Debería haber un protagonismo activo de la sociedad civil organizada, de los ciudadanos, para permitir que estas políticas realmente cumplan con los objetivos basados en derechos humanos.
We'll get some more questions in a minute.
Yeah. Let me comment on both parts of that. The first, that this is potentially a special moment in Peru. I've met so far 2 politicians. I had a good meeting with the mayor of Lima this morning, and a brief meeting with the minister. I think we're going to have a longer meeting tomorrow morning. But what both of those people said, the mayor of Lima and the Minister of Health, suggest that this is a very important moment. There really is an opportunity to do things differently. We heard from the advisor to the Vice Minister a moment ago that we're going to meet with other ministers tomorrow morning to push the idea of health in all policies across the department. And what the mayor said to me this morning was exactly the line that health is a good way of measuring her success in all the other domains that she wants to approach. So I really think this is a good moment, and we should seize it. And as I've said many times already in the 24 hours, 32 hours that I've been here, that I'm hoping one of the things we can do is make a partnership, make Peru and the city of Lima partners. Your question about civil society, clearly you did not want me to say civil society has no role, and I won't say that because it's not true. Civil society has a very important role. I mentioned when I showed you the slide of my meeting with Manmohan Singh that Mirai Chatterjee was in the slide, and she's one of the leaders of the Self-Employed Women's Association in India. which is a civil society organization. And one of the points she made very strongly on the Commission is if government won't do it, or if government can't do it, then civil society has to do it. And what SEDA did, the Self-Employed Women's Association, was take a whole series of actions that improved the quality of women's lives and then push government to implement it. So some of the government schemes that I mentioned quickly in passing came because of the demonstration from civil society organizations that this was feasible and necessary to do. We said in the Commission report, and I hope this is true, but we said it, that all social advances have come from social action, whether it's improvement of working conditions that came from the union movement, universal suffrage. Politicians didn't say, oh, we'll give women the vote. Women came out and said, we want the vote, we demand the vote. And then finally the politicians gave women the vote. When politicians didn't let people vote who didn't own property, they didn't suddenly say, oh, we'll let people who don't own property vote. People who didn't own property demanded the right to vote, universal suffrage. So the trade union movement, the women's movement, universal suffrage, comes from social action, which means civil society. Absolutely vital. And governments listen. Governments really listen because it's one expression of the mood of the people. And I've quoted many times, and I love, but I'm glad to have the opportunity to quote them again, what they say in Thailand. They talk about the mountain that moves society. And the mountain, the triangle, I beg your pardon, the triangle that, they say in Thailand, I'm tired, they say in Thailand, they talk about the triangle that moves the mountain, the triangle that moves the mountain. The three corners of the triangle that moves the mountain are knowledge, which includes academia, government, and the people. And I went to the Health Assembly in Bangkok a couple of years ago, and there they had it. They had government, in fact the Prime Minister came, academia, your humble servant, and civil society leaders. So we need the triangle that moves the mountain. We need civil society, we need government, and we need the knowledge. So the evidence shows that civil society has an absolutely fundamental role. And I would say what I just showed you about the firefighters in Liverpool is an example of civil society in action. Well, I don't know about heaven or hell. I'm not an expert in these matters, but I think when you go out onto the roads and try and drive home, that looks a bit more like hell than it does like heaven to me out here. Just in relation to your interesting comments, I've been very clear what I mean by health inequity. I'm not talking about differences between individuals. And so the fact that each individual is unique is I do not include in my purview. I've been very clear that I'm talking about differences between social groups, differences in health between social groups that are judged to be avoidable by reasonable means. And I think all of that's important. Social groups, not individuals, that are judged to be avoidable by reasonable means. Now the reasonable means we can debate. What is a reasonable mean? That will depend on the society and the values and the resources and a whole set of things. But I don't mean that all individuals should be equal, because that's not within our purview. I mean, if you equalize social conditions, all the individual differences would be genetic. Of course they would. What else is there? Chance. And so there'd be chance or genetic. So I'm not talking about individual differences. I'm talking about systematic differences between social groups. Now, that could be to the extent that the male-female differences are social, not biological. That would include gender differences, ethnic differences, socioeconomic differences that are judged to be avoidable by reasonable means. That's what I mean by the unfairness, the inequity. I think what you said about, if I understood correctly, what you said about primary health care, there's no question that a lot of people interpreted that to mean primary care. So the social determinants part that was very clearly in the Alma-Ata Declaration got forgotten. People thought that was primary care. And in fact, I could see within WHO there was some move to want to try and pretend that there was nothing about social determinants of health. All we really needed was primary health care. Well, one can use language, as Humpty Dumpty said, the question who is to be master. You can use language in any way one likes, but most people interpret primary health care to mean primary care. And we're clearly talking about something more than that. And Nita Roses, when she came, the director of PAHO, when she came to one of the commission meetings, she talked about the sisterhood between primary care and social determinants of health. We need both, and they're complementary, very clearly. What about specific diseases? We use the language of the causes of the causes. So we know smoking. I mean, we've just had this high-level meeting in New York on non-communicable disease. We know the causes of non-communicable disease. They had 4 risk factors in New York: smoking, diet, physical activity, and alcohol. I wouldn't say it's totally useless. I wouldn't go that far to identify those 4 risk factors. But what I did say, without looking at the social distribution of those risk factors, without looking at the social causes of those risk factors, you're not going to make much impact. So by all means, let's use the best science we have to understand the causes of specific diseases, but let's address the causes of the causes, whether it's dirty water, whether it's sexually transmitted infection, whether it's so-called lifestyle. Let's address the causes of cause. For example, I showed a slide in my presentation in New York about the relation between price and consumption for alcohol. You couldn't see a clearer relation between price and consumption. The real price relative to income of alcohol in Britain has gone down like that, and alcohol consumption has gone up like that. Alcohol is now less than half the real cost that it was 30 years ago, and consumption has doubled. So we know alcohol is a cause of premature illness, avoidable illness, but unless we address the causes of alcohol consumption, we're not going to make progress. So there's no trade-off. I mean, it's not that you should either address specific diseases or social determinants. Let's understand the best science, the specific diseases, and then let's address the causes of that. It then relates to your point about HIV/AIDS. I think the work on HIV/AIDS has been of fundamental importance of trying to understand a more social approach. Mary Robinson, the sainted Mary Robinson, the former UN High Commissioner for whatever it is for human rights, she came to the launch that we had in London of the Commission on Social Determinants of Health, and she said, "Where's human rights in all this?" And I said, "You mean jobs for lawyers?" And she said, "Come and see me. I'll be back in London next Monday. Come and see me. I'll be staying at this hotel. So forgive me for this indulgence, but I've been at it all day." So I got on my bicycle, as I do, I cycle everywhere in London, and it was pissing down with rain. It was raining so hard. So I had my wet weather gear on, and I get into to the hotel where she's staying, and I look like a drowned seal. I sort of walk in, just dripping everywhere. And a voice says, "Hello, Michael," and it turned out to be her assistant. She said, "Mary will be down in a moment." I thought, well, I've got a chance to try and make myself presentable. So I'm I get to my waterproof trousers, and I start pulling down my waterproof trousers. I did have ordinary trousers. And I get this far, I'm over here, and a voice says, "Hello, Michael," and it was Mary Robinson. Talk about recovering your dignity. And I'm down here with my trousers half off. What can you do? I said, "I'll just finish taking my trousers off, and then I'll say hello." I'm trying to do my James Bond there. And what she said to me was that this is not about jobs for lawyers. It doesn't go to litigation. This is about an approach. And I've been criticized. People say I'm a slow learner, that with the English review we didn't say enough about human rights. I think I'm getting there, that the approaches, what she said to me was that taking a human rights approach will help you with social determinants of health. We're in the same arena here. We're talking about human rights and the same arena. But she reassured me, this is not just about jobs for lawyers. This is about an approach, a human rights approach to health and well-being. So I hope I'm getting there. I hope I'm learning. Let me put together your question about, is it too abstract? With the comment, you didn't ask me to comment on your comments, but the comment that, well, we've been busily building inequality in Peru for 500 years, maybe it's too difficult to sail upstream. And I think the answer to that comment and the question about is it too abstract go together. I have not looked at historical data on life expectancy in Peru, but I have looked at the historical data on life expectancy for a lot of countries. And the health of the worst off has improved all over the place. And I guarantee that the health of the worst off in Peru has improved, even though I've not seen the data, because it has. I mentioned India. Look how much it's improved in India. So that the health of the worst off can improve dramatically. So much so, the English data, which I know very well, if we were having this discussion 40 years ago, we'd look at the social gradient in health, and we might say, oh gosh, we've been busily building inequality in England for hundreds of years. This is just impossible. We can't do anything. Well, the life expectancy of the bottom social group now is greater than the life expectancy of the top social group 40 years ago. The worst off today are better than the best off were 40 years ago. That's how dramatic the improvement has been. How do we get there? Well, it's a complicated question, but it comes back, that's why I say I put the two together. And I talked about civil society. Let me say a few words about the Self-Employed Women's Association of India. You look at the situation of the poorest women of India. I talked about it a bit in lunchtime. And SABR got involved in providing childcare. Not luxurious childcare. I mean, if I was in Stanford talking to groups a couple of years ago at Stanford University in California, and they're saying, oh, this is all too difficult, you know, the government, you know, dealing with poverty in California is all too difficult. And I said, you ought to see what they're doing in Gujarat, in India. Do you think it's too difficult in California? Your poor people are fantastically well off compared with the poor of India. And they're providing childcare. When they were being ripped off by loan sharks, they created a saver bank to provide microcredit. I went to a board meeting of the Saver Bank. I've never been invited to Bank of America board meeting, but I was invited to the Saver Bank. And there are these women, Dalit, outcast women in their colourful saris. And at the end of the board meeting, they sing the Gujarati equivalent of, "We shall overcome." I bet you they don't do that at the Bank of America board meeting. They've created pensions. They've created sickness insurance. They've created healthcare. So they take the poorest, most marginal women and they say, we can make a difference. And by golly, they are making a difference. And I could quote you example after example after example. I had a young professor at one American university says she teaches a class based on the commission report. And about halfway through every class in the US, some students say, we need a revolution. And she said to me, what would you say? And I said, tell them to read my report. We didn't call for a revolution. We called for investment in early child development, good parenting, reading to children. That's not a revolution. You can do that. You can read to children. We talked about improving the access to education and improving the education system. You can do that. We talk about improving employment and working conditions. You can do that. We didn't once talk about a revolution. And people ask me, is this just about income? And in relation to the English review, I say no. Only one of our recommendations was about income. We had 6 recommendations, and only one was about income. So thank you for your comment, suggesting that this is a different paradigm. Thank you for your comment suggesting that we do go upstream, but it's not as difficult as it sounds, because most governments have a ministry for education. Most governments have a ministry that deals with environment and planning. Most governments have a ministry that deal with employment and work. So it's not a matter of we, poor struggling health practitioners, have to wade out upstream. It's that we have to form partnerships with those whose core business is improving education, is improving the environment, is improving finance and employment and working conditions. But then I would say, put health equity in all those policies. Let's get together to try and create a more just society.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Les invitamos a un cafecito caliente ahí con...
Estar juntos aquí en el patio. Gracias, doctor Miguel Malo, por actuar de moderador en esta parte en la cual hemos escuchado las sugerencias y comentarios del auditorio hoy presente en este conversatorio. Muchas gracias, señor Michael Marmot, por su presencia. También el agradecimiento al doctor Fernando Leanes, representante de la OMS en el Perú, por encabezar y liderar este importante conversatorio. A todos ustedes por dar realce a este importante evento. Tengan todos ustedes muy buenas tardes. Permiso.